You can write an ensemble cast in any genre. Let's dig into how. Why would you to begin with? It can be a lot of fun. Myself, I love a good ensemble cast story. It's my favorite kind of story personally, but in serials, it can be especially helpful because you are writing a story that can go on for dozens and dozens of episodes and even multiple seasons, like a TV show. A lot of TV shows have ensemble casts because it makes writing a longer story much easier because instead of focusing on one or a few main characters all the time, you have several that you can switch between. And the more characters you have, the more time you have for showing character growth in a serial. You, in shorter stories, things like novels, you don't necessarily have tons and tons of time to show character growth. If you're writing a series, yeah, you have more time. But if you're writing a contained 60,000 word novel, you don't have a ton of time to delve into character growth. You have to stick to a few simple arcs as opposed to a bunch of arcs that can show a character maturing for years. So you have more time in a serial to show character growth, which means that you can have more main characters as well because you can show character growth across several main characters instead of really needing two or three. The greater potential for conflict. So when you have seven main characters, there's a lot of potential for conflict. I grew up in a big family, which was great at times, but there was also the more people in any given situation, the more chance there is for conflict. Conversely, the more triumphant the reader feels when they all come together and it all worked out, the longer your serial can go with more characters. If you have three main characters and their arc goes from here to here, then you might have 60 episodes of story. If you have seven main characters and they still have 3-point character arcs, you've just double and a half the length of your story. So it's now 2.5 times as long and very likely even longer because the more characters you add, even if they have the same amount of character growth and development, a 3-point character arc, for example, the more characters you have, the more the interaction, conflict, and cooperation between the characters. So the longer the serial gets. So if you are really looking to write a serial story that can go on for quite a while, an ensemble cast makes this a lot easier to do than if you have two main characters. Also, the more characters you have in a story as main characters or secondary characters, there's more variety. Think about your friend group or someone's friend group that you know, or even an ensemble cast of your favorite TV show. There are different types of personality, of course, because that's just how humans work. In stories, having a large cast of characters, you're automatically going to have quite a bit of variety. And that makes the story even more fun to write. It also introduces even more potential conflict and collaboration and cooperation. It can get really fun. Also, managing large casts of characters does not have to be hard. We're going to go into that a little bit. Ensemble cast type one. This is the type of cast that most people think about when they think ensemble cast. You frequently see it in epic scale stories like fantasy and sci fi. Pretty much every sci-fi show, most sci-fi shows have an ensemble cast and a lot of fantasy shows and series. The trick to writing them without overwhelming the reader is to choose a few characters to focus on at once and to make sure that the reader is properly introduced to each character and spends enough time with each character to connect with them before moving on. This can be especially easy to achieve if you have one main character who's slightly more front man than the rest. So most Star Trek shows start out like this, at least the Star Trek shows from the 90s start out like this, where your captain is usually the connection to the rest of the crew. So you'll start with the captain, and it's the captain's connection to other characters that gives you a connection to those other characters. And you see these characters through the captain's eyes at first. And then once you've gotten to know the other characters a little bit more, then they start getting their own episodes. So you start by building out one character, and their connections to the rest of the characters are what help your reader understand and connect with those other characters. And once they've connected enough with those other characters that they're rooting for them or attached to them or interested in them, then you can go on to focus on those characters for their own arcs or episodes. The biggest thing to remember when you are writing an ensemble cast of this type, besides making sure that everyone has a chance for the reader to really understand and connect with them, is make sure that everyone gets a turn in the spotlight. Because if you have a main cast of 7 characters and maybe you've built out your connections really well, but only 5 of them consistently get a turn in the spotlight, then 2 of them become not really ensemble characters. They're more secondary or minor. So make sure that everyone gets a turn in the spotlight, but first make sure that your reader has connected with each of these characters and is invested in them. And just do that slowly. You're writing a serial, you have time to do that. Ensemble cast type 2. This is common in a lot of mystery, thrillers, romance, and lit RPG. You have one or a few main characters, and then you have a large secondary character cast. Your main characters are the connection to the secondary cast, and the secondary cast doesn't really have main story. Like they'll have side stories, there'll be side quests, there'll be subplots and story arcs that they're involved in, but not usually without the main characters, as opposed to the other kind of ensemble cast where you can spend an entire arc with 2 of them, that's where the others don't show up as much. Mysteries do this a lot, where the detective and their sidekick are the front facing characters, and the people that they work with are secondary. And frequently they'll get subplots, they'll get involved in this group of them will be more involved in this arc, and this group over here will be more involved in this arc. But in general, they don't have stories unconnected to the main characters. You see this in romance serials as well, where especially in a series where the focus is on one pair at a time, but there are 5 pairs that the serial goes through. The main pair in each arc are the main characters, but then there are secondary characters who will go on to become the pairs in the next arc or the arc after that. Lit RPG does this as well, where you have 1 or 2 main characters and maybe the rest of the party or occasional traveling companions are the secondary ensemble characters. Tips for writing it well: your main character is your connection to the other characters. It's not just one connection, it's not just the primary connection, it is the connection to the other characters. You can write scenes from other characters' perspectives just fine, but in general, if you go off on this whole side arc with one of these side characters, you might have some pacing issues to smooth over, because if you are writing an ensemble cast of this type where your main character or few main characters are the driving central characters of the story, then going off on a side quest with these characters can bore people. And then you might actually be writing a different kind of ensemble cast. Make sure to really develop the relationships between the main character and the secondary characters, because again, your main character is the perspective through which your readers are going to see the story. So if you're just developing the secondary character and not really focusing on what the relationship is as well, then it can really feel disconnected, disjointed, and choppy. And another thing to be very careful of is side characters love to steal the spotlight sometimes. This is fine sometimes. If you are writing a story or if you are writing a serial and this issue keeps cropping up where side characters are stealing the spotlight, a couple things to ask yourself. Are you really writing the main character in a way that interests you? or the side characters may be better main characters. Further tips on writing ensemble casts in any genre. Don't overwhelm readers with too many characters at once. We talked about that a few minutes ago, where if you focus on one character at a time and their connection to another character until the reader knows that other character well enough that they can take center stage, you avoid throwing too many names at a reader at once, which is a mistake that I used to make in the past. Introduce characters one at a time or two at a time in the beginning, again, so you don't overwhelm readers with how many there are. And you can have an ensemble cast of antagonists as well as protagonists. So if you have a party of adventurers, you can have a party of villains as well. You can have multiple kinds of villains. You can have low level villains working for high level villains. You can have high level villains collaborating with each other. You can do a lot with an ensemble cast. And always remember that your genre's tone is going to inform how your cast works together, operates, and is presented within the world.